Hello, this is Mark Mitchell again. Hope you're having a good day. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 7 for a few moments. Chapter 7 is all about interaction, groups, and organizations, and there are some topics in the chapter that we've seen before, and those we will not spend as much time on as we have where they were covered in a different video. Our chapter outline is next, and it really shows all the topics we're going to cover today from beginning to end, and starting from the basic definitions of social interaction all the way down to a changing world with backstage privacy and social media. So we have a lot of ending information in the chapters about the digital world and digital revolution that our author has included. We also have a few additional articles in the chapter. That's just something we've seen from chapter after chapter, but they help to give a different perspective on some of the topics that were promised in the chapter. All right, and as we start off today, we are looking at something called intersubjectivity, but our book goes on to describe that this is a term that sociologists use to really talk about the two words before that. It is a common or shared language and knowledge that people share in order to make sense and have a common understanding about their discussion, their interaction, or their conversation that's going on. And this might remind you of what we've covered before, as I mentioned earlier, in a different chapter about symbols and language. That certainly is, I think, a good way to think about it. And there's also a picture on this page in our textbook, and it shows two really familiar things to a lot of different cultures. And if you're not familiar with it, then you won't get it. But it's actually Queen Elizabeth II. Her face is imposed on really kind of a pose that Marilyn Monroe was made famous for in a movie. But that was an outside advertisement in a European country. But if you know those two things, then that really kind of gives you a common understanding of the type of ad that they were trying to run. If you don't, then it really doesn't make sense. So we wouldn't expect everybody to get it, but certainly where it is, people should understand that clearly. All right, and as we move on, our book talks about the Thomas theorem. And this is just an idea that if you define something as real, then it becomes real. So, for example, for us in our class, test days, they are defined as such and such a date, and they really become real because that's when the test occurs. Our book has a different example, and I'm going to flip the slide ahead real quick to show you, and then I'll go back to where I am now. But really, we've got a map of the world, and this is the one on the left really looks more familiar to us because that's what we've seen. It's been defined as this is how the world looks like and all the land masses around the world. But in reality, what our book provides us is that the image on the right, even though the continents are a little bit elongated than what they really are, is actually probably more accurate. They call it the Peters projection. But there, we would automatically wonder, what in the world is this? Because it doesn't match our expectation of what we have defined as real before. All right, so that's a good example of the Thomas theorem. And another vocabulary item that's mentioned here that we're very familiar with is stereotypes. And so one of the examples our book gives us is, if you're into fitness and running, you may be into that, but a stereotype is that, well, hey, if you're from Kenya in Africa, then you're a fast runner. Or we've heard lots of these before that maybe that some categories of people are better athletes than others. You've probably heard that blondes are not smart, and we're not trying to offend anybody, but there's just lots of these stereotypes that are out there. And they're really not based on fact, but there's usually something, like our book mentions, distorted or untrue, false generalization or experience that somebody had. You may have come across somebody that is pictured like in our next slide, but somebody who is homeless. I know in my travels to Smithfield, I often see a lot of people near the Walmart, and in other places that I've gone, it seems to be Walmart is a location where people who need help are. And on occasion, I have helped people with food, but I don't ever give out money. That's just one of the things that I do. I just don't want it to be used inappropriately, and I've had some situations where that happened before and just decided to adopt that policy going forward. But our book uses this as another example of the Thomas theorem, but based on how you maybe think of people who are homeless or unemployed. Maybe that's where the stereotype kicks in. If you feel that they're not worthy of your money, then maybe that influences what you do, that your subjective definition, and then what you do is the objective result. We have 3 steps, at least according to Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman from some time ago. But they say, for example, what creates social reality is the 3 factors we see here. And I know that can be a little hard sometimes when everybody comes up with a different term for their ideas, but that's what we have here. And by externalization, really what these gentlemen mean is people are going to somehow create their reality. They're going to create their society in which the social world in which we live. The second point, the objectivation, is there. It's we can't forget that society is human-made. And the way we look at things tends to be the natural way that we see them. And then finally, their third factor, internalization, is that our social creations really take on a life of themselves, and it helps in some ways to influence or to shape. It makes known and establishes our view of the world. That's how the world is perceived in our eyes. Now here, when we see from a previous chapter, lots of terms in chapter 4, so we're not going to spend a lot of time there except for the ones maybe that we didn't see. I think we talked about all of these except for a master status, and that's just one that's really important that influences all the other statuses in one's life. So a good example of that would be race, could be illness, disease. It could be something good like power or money, or it could be something infamous, such as someone who's murdered, such as a serial killer or something along those lines. But it's just very influential and affects every other thing in your life. We haven't mentioned the role conflict and role strain, and again, I'm going to slide ahead one slide. I think we've got a great example in our book that helps to really make clear what's going on here. But I like to start with role strain. I've tried to create a memory aid device, but strain starts with an S. But a role strain are the behaviors that are attached to one single status. I'm trying to use S all the time. But you can see the social position is a worker, and then that worker has 2 roles that he or she would have to somehow manage. So one of the complications here is to meet the boss's expectations and then overlook slacking coworkers. So there you've got to meet both of these, and that's where the strain comes in. What do you do? On the other hand, you could have role conflict, and so that involves multiple social positions, that of a student, that of a worker, that of a child, and then all the demands that you have that are related to each social position. That's what we have here. So a student has the assignments that he or she must do, again, the task at work you must do, and then the parental role that maybe you have to do. And so a lot of times, what you have to do is maybe neglect one to the other, but that's not always the case. Maybe you can be creative and meet all of these. So I remember a few examples where you'd have something like our slide has, and they were able to meet all the expectations rather than choosing one over the other. All right, we next moved there to dramaturgy, and really this is looking at life as like a part of a movie set or on a theater in a stage play, but you're always playing a role in life. So that's not a bad idea or a way to look at it. Irving Goffman, again, is a name who really looks at this. And so, we know when we play our roles and parts well and when we when we don't. All right. We also, related to that, have some other topics. Our book mentions role expectations. And then there it's simply, for example, that, what is expected of us, again, during these social positions that we have. We've got to have the appropriate costumes. We've got to have the appropriate language and emotions, all to pull off the proper role. All right, so you may be a child of your parents. You may be a sibling, again, a student, a worker, and you've got to always constantly have all the aspects of your role in the right way in order to pull off that social status. Impression management, for example, there we are trying to control what others think of us. We probably have had plenty of experience with this if we think about it. If you've ever dated anybody, you've had to use impression management. If you've ever had a job, maybe you went through an interview, you had to give them the impression that you were a capable candidate and worthy of their investment. And then once you were on the job, you had to actually prove that too, and to all the maybe customers that you may serve. All right, the front stage and the back stage, maybe a good example there is, let's say you had a job as a waiter or a waitress, and you're serving up the food in this restaurant that people come to. And at the front stage is where you interact with all your customers, and you have to put on your polite face and look nice and, be nice and cater to their needs in a very timely way. And then the backstage is where maybe the food is being prepared in the cook room. And there you can kind of maybe not be as nice because your public face is not on display. And our book has a good example of somebody who had enough of this, but he was a flight attendant. And working with people can sometimes be very hard because they're so demanding. But he had enough, and our book just mentioned there that he had a fit, started cursing, ranting, and raving, and then he exited the plane. By the little inflatable ramp he just jumped on, since he had quit his job, it didn't matter anymore. But there's where he couldn't let the negatives of the job affect him anymore. He just had enough. I'm sure we all feel like that time to time, but we may not do it. All right, when we change gears a little bit here in the chapter, we go to social networks, and often these are weak social ties. Our book does not include that in the definition, but it's somehow we've got a connection one to another. It may be from a personal way because we care about people, or it may be at work in a professional way, or something else like that. There's lots of networks, and our book gives us a few examples to choose from. A researcher who was really interested in this some time ago was George Simmel, but he realized, for example, that life was made up of these connections and these patterned interactions among individuals. So they are important. All right, and I mentioned there about the different types, so we got some more current research there, and they are just examining some of those different types of networks. And, Haven, again, that's that safe place of sense and belonging and fellowship. Safety nets was another type. I'm not going to mention them all, but just some of the different ones that were out there. So they certainly do fulfill a lot of needs that people have. And our book does, in just a few slides, makes another distinction between changing of the past versus today in terms of how people are connected one to another. So it's changing a little bit. All right, but homophily is a term that we see in our book, but it really means love of the same. That's what that word actually means. But it just talks about how social networks tend to be composed of people of like attributes, whether it's age, social class, religion, race, or politics in their worldview, or what have you. But that certainly kind of makes sense to think about it in terms of that way. Maybe also our book has a short mentioning of how sometimes when maybe you're face-to-face and you're a college student, that's probably the time in your life where you're around the most different kind of people that you're ever going to meet. And so usually when people have some experience with different groups, just like maybe what we've mentioned here on the slide, then they tend to be open to those networks. It is really kind of interesting, some of the research that our book mentions, and one of those interesting things that's not on the slide is called the Matthew effect, and that comes from the Bible in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 29, but it really just talks about how people's network size, it gets bigger and richer, and for those who try to extend it, and for those who don't, their networks and their contents of those networks get poorer and poorer. But that verse says, "For to all those who have, more will be given, but from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away." So there's a good reason why they call it the Matthew effect. All right. As we move on here, just it gives us a good example of some of the attackers on 9/11, and they have actually tried to look at their social network. It's kind of a little hard to understand, but you can see the hijackers that are highlighted in yellow, and then their relationships, whether they were close or far, to all the other contacts that are on this figure. When we talk about social groups, as we move along, we're talking about people who are together and they interact. So there's lots of people who are together in the same place, but if they don't interact, they can't be considered a group. And the smallest group that you can have is two. Often the most important groups are very small in life that we have. And for example, a marriage is a group of two people, but just remember when you talk about groups, they've got to have that interaction in order to be called a group. They really use different words if they don't have that interaction to talk about them. So it could be a crowd, it could be a category, it could be a number of things, but what they have, those other words have in common is no interaction. Now, two types of groups in our book that are mentioned are primary and secondary, and so really the difference is just the type of relationship. One is very emotional, the other is not. Secondary groups are really based on a task. Primary groups are based on relationships. And so life is really made up of all types of groups. It's very rare that you can do anything in life without being part of a group. And if you do, it gets unbearable after a little while. Most of our life is spent involved with other people in some way, form, or fashion. Another type of group is a reference group, and that's one that we measure ourselves against. So, for example, think of your social media account and your friends there, and often if you feel good about yourself, it's because you're measuring yourself against your friends and how well you perceive yourself as doing. And if you feel bad, then it's maybe that you feel like you have not kept up with them. So there's lots of researchers out there who have done some things like this with reference group. Our book doesn't mention it, but Samuel Stouffer is one. But he did this with military personnel, and really how they felt good or bad about their chances for promotion were based on how they perceived themselves relative to others in their reference group. Okay. We also have a short section there on group size, and so the smallest group we've already mentioned was two people or a dyad. You can keep adding people to your group. Our book also mentions a three-group person or a triad, and our next slide illustrates some more, but you just keep extending the possible number of relationships the more that you add. All right, so once groups get too big, maybe for our purposes, a lot of places that we can be on campus really are no more than 6. If you think of the cafeteria or some of the desks in class, they're even smaller than that, but it's because conversations get a little harder to follow unless some different rules are applied. All right, we do see part of the chapter where it talks about how the digital age has affected social networks. And so here we just again have a couple more recent researchers who kind of compare some of these differences, and they can best be seen on this next slide. The difference in groups and networks, and they do have some similarities, but again, this chart really focuses on some of the differences. All right, but It's not that there's anything better or worse. It's just really a difference in how they're carried out today due to a lot of the technology that's more in use today than was in the past. We've been looking at a lot in the chapter about groups, and now we switch to organizations and bureaucracy. So think of corporations and businesses who are designed to perform a task. Bureaucracy, think of more of government and their regulations to govern people. And the point of these things is really kind of more related to our secondary groups as compared to primary groups where it's all about relationships. All right, so think of why all the companies that are in the United States, why they exist, but it's really to make a profit and to satisfy customers. Just on a side note, I read an article today, but it seems like a lot of businesses are closing down, and maybe that's related to the middle class just really, really struggling. But I think this year, if the pace continues as it has so far, about 9,000 businesses will permanently shut its doors, and not quite that many did that last year. So that's really kind of scary to me to think that many businesses are having trouble, because it really talks about the middle class not having the disposable income to keep these businesses open. All right, but back to the chapter. We've got a bureaucracy defined for us, but it's a system there with a formal structure to it from top to bottom. It has rules and regulations that it operates by, and it does that in order to manage itself and to achieve its key functions that have been defined. So our book does, according to Max Weber, it has some characteristics you can see here on the chart that organizations just do. They do this out of tradition. A lot of them been around for quite a while. I think some of the oldest organizations on earth go back to some sort of mail type system that was used in China, thousands of years ago. Here's an example of some of the hierarchy and then the different positions that we talked about from the previous slide, but this is the University of Miami that our book has provided for us, and I don't think JCC is really much that different at all. There may be a few different labels up here, but the organization seems pretty much the same. All right, but we can go to the culture and the environment of organizations. And this is, for example, factors that really operate how it works. Our book gives a good example of Time Warner and AOL and how they merged in order to cut expenses and boost profitability. There's lots of mergers all the time in the business world, but they could not get their culture to and their environment of these two separate entities. They couldn't get it to match each other, and so they had a lot of trouble. And after a few years, the merger failed. But a lot of these employees at AOL, they were used to doing things differently compared to Time Warner, which had a longer history and did things on paper. They didn't do it digitally. They held on to their assets a long time, whereas AOL, they wanted to make a lot of money quickly, and they just had a lot of problems and just didn't see eye to eye, and nobody saw that this would be a problem ahead of time. We also have in-groups and out-groups. In-groups are usually esteemed. They're seen positively, as our slide indicates. The kind of seen as us versus the out-group, which is seen as them. They're seen negatively. I know I have an article, and it's called The Roughnecks and the Saints, but the Saints would be the in-group. They were seen positively by people in the neighborhood, by teachers, by police officers, whereas the Roughnecks were all seen negatively. And a good movie, many of you probably have seen. It's a little bit old, got a lot of modern TV stars in it today, but it was called The Outsiders, but is a good example of those in-groups and out-groups. Solomon Asch, of some years ago, conducted an experiment called the conformity experiments, and our book has or the slide rather, illustrates the point of the experiment, but asked people to match up the line on the left to the one on the right that best represented its size. And so I'll give you a moment, and you can think to yourself which letter you would say that matches up to the line on the left. And it is obviously B. And what Solomon Ash found was that most people would actually give an incorrect answer. Now, I deliberately gave the wrong answer there. I know you're probably saying, well, he's blind. But the real line that matches up is really C. But in the Ash experiment, when he started with the students, they would give either A or B, an obviously incorrect answer. And then the last few students in the room would be the ones who were really not in on it, and they wanted to see if there was enough pressure by wrong answers to also for them to give a wrong answer. And so a lot of the times the students would, because everybody else did. And so I hope when you were looking at the lines, you disagreed with me and were kind of maybe saying something about me that I just didn't hear, because I was just trying to reproduce that as the best that I could. All right, but another classic experiment is Stanley Milgram, and this is very familiar too. They're all over the internet, and our book actually gives an update from 2010 of a game show that really did the same thing and found about the same results. But Stanley Milgram found that people would shock others to the point they could knock them out or kill them, and they did it simply because they were obeying authority. And so the real point of Stanley Milgram is, would people obey in a situation that they knew they shouldn't? So, most of the people in the experiment did that, and it's not because they were bad people. It's just because they were told to do so, and they thought whoever was in charge knew what they were doing. So, if we were to run those experiments again, do you think most people would follow right along? And hopefully they wouldn't. I think today in our society, more people are. Seems at least they're rebellious of authority, but hopefully they wouldn't. We also have a slide here that talks about groupthink, and maybe it's a good place to put it here in the book, but it's when people just automatically stop thinking and they just latch on to others' ideas. And so this can have harmful consequences, and I think in reality probably the nearest we've had to a third world war was back in the 60s during the Kennedy administration. It was the Bay of Pigs situation in Cuba. But there, Russia was going to put some missiles on Cuba, which is about 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And that alarmed the United States government. But in those meetings, a lot of people didn't really do a lot of independent thinking, but they simply kind of just agreed with whatever who in charge said. And so that's not what you need in a meeting of that importance, especially if somebody starts off with the wrong answer that winds up killing millions and millions of people. All right, but the opposite of groupthink, I would argue, is brainstorming, where you come up as many ideas as possible. All right. We also have something kind of interesting called oligarchy, but that's the rule of the many by the few, and that's certainly, I think, most governments around the world, that's exactly how they're formed. And the iron law of oligarchy says that people who start out maybe with noble intentions, they eventually make decisions that benefit themselves. So forgive the reference, but I know in the Spider-Man comic, they would say absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think that's kind of what the point is of the iron law of oligarchy. It's not Spider-Man, but it's the fact that that absolute power maybe that a dictator has, you may start out with noble intentions, but eventually that changes. So whenever I think of that, I think of Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, who was a socialist and would take all kinds of assets in the name of the people of Venezuela, but yet he died with billions of dollars in his bank account. And if he were a true socialist, that never would have happened. But I think he is a good example of that iron law of oligarchy. Frederick Taylor's idea is mentioned next under this power in groups and organizations, but he is one of the fathers of scientific management, and that's just a precise calculation of everything that's done. He and Henry Ford, for example, did it in terms of factory work, but they wanted to cut out waste and inefficiency, and so they would map every single movement and step of workers in order to maximize their productivity. And so a lot of our world today is still does that process there to just really kind of be as efficient as you can. We talked about that in another chapter as McDonaldization, which is related to that, but still kind of a little bit different. Now, getting to the end of our chapter, we see, again, something that we've covered or remind you of something we've covered. But there, the backstage, privacy and social media. And so really, that we've seen some news stories about with Facebook and how they really are not protecting personal data, and that fits in really well to this section. But things that people want to keep private and should be private, they're not really doing that at all. And, do you really have privacy in our world anymore today? And it doesn't seem to be that way. I know before the Facebook news, there was, the idea that people who are in the entertainment business, they rarely ever get any private time. They would have the paparazzi taking pictures and recording them when it should have been private moments. But now this has been extended even to, normal citizens. Think about with your phones. Is every phone call you make being recorded? Google is one of these companies that has a lot of information about people. But those are just a couple examples, I think, of what our book means. So there are a few more slides, and, of course, these are in Blackboard. I think I will leave those if you want to cover them yourselves, but they're just some final questions on the chapter that get you thinking. But if I can help you, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I will see you the next time. Thank you.